Hello everyone, to all our viewers watching this at home. I'm your host Stanley Tan and welcome back to Ask Paul Anything. And with me today, of course, we have, Prof. Paul Tambaya, who is here to answer all of your questions. So Prof. Paul, today we actually have a lot of questions ranging, from medical questions to economics and social issues and politics. So maybe let's dive right into the first question. It's by Shawal Tan. His question is monkeypox a serious threat?
Well, at the moment, we don't know for sure. But the good news is that there was a large study recently published with more than 5,000 cases coming from 16 countries. And what it showed was that there were no deaths and there were only 3 cases of complications. All 3 cases resolved relatively quickly. And in fact, only one of the 3 cases needed any specific antiviral treatment. So now the WHO has declared this a global public health emergency. Hopefully resources will be mobilized and it will be contained. But then again, I'm an optimist.
Thank you. So for the next question is a 2-part by Mike Tan. What is your take on Dr. Gert Vanden-Bosch's warning that the current mass vaccination eliciting non-neutralizing antibodies in the midst of a pandemic is allowing the virus to mutate even faster in the population, to become more infectious than Omicron, and it might soon overcome the pressure on virulence, leading to serious illnesses and death on vaccinees?
So this is what they call ADE, or antibody-dependent enhancement, and this is a very real theoretical risk. It was one that was seen in animal studies of earlier coronavirus vaccines, and it's also seen best in dengue. That's why the second episode of dengue fever is often worse than the first one. And in fact, that's the reason why the dengue vaccine never really took off, because what happened was it became like the first dengue infection, and people who got dengue after vaccination ended up getting more severe. While this theoretical risk cannot be ignored, the fact is that despite the huge rise in the number of cases in highly vaccinated populations like in Europe, North America, or even in Singapore, we haven't seen a rise in the number of deaths or the number of ICU cases. So what this suggests that, this, while it's a theoretical risk and we should not ignore it, if it does occur, it's kind of rare. And it doesn't affect the majority of cases. So be aware, but at the moment, it doesn't seem a major threat.
Okay, that's great. Now let's move on to the second part of the question. Mike Tan also asks, do you believe Singapore is prepared to fight any endemic in times to come? Pandemic, sorry.
Well, as I've said many times before, Singapore has really good doctors, nurses, and some of the world's best allied health professionals. We also have great infrastructure. We're small, we're compact, easy to do contact tracing and to contain outbreaks. And I don't think anybody anywhere in the world is sort of really that well prepared to deal with pandemics, but we're prepared as anyone else. The big problem, though, is the healthcare system is got big issues with financing. There's also issues of stigma and discrimination, which sometimes make it difficult for people to come forward. So I think, theoretically, again, we are prepared, but when it comes to the crunch, we can't be sure.
Okay, now we'll move on to the next question by Teo Siu Ming. It was projected that by 2050, every 1 out of 3 locals will be seniors. What are your and the SDP's plans for the 1.2 million seniors in GE 2025?
Well, first off, I think that's a little bit of a generous definition of seniors, because by that definition, I'll be a senior too. So, but jokes aside, the SDP proposed the RISE, or the Retirement Income Scheme for Elderly, during the last general election. And this was a refinement on the universal basic pension that we had proposed actually way back in 2011. And the idea is that all retired Singaporeans should be paid in cash, $500 a month. They were in the bottom 80% of wage earners. And it sounds like a lot of money, but in reality, what we do is we get rid of all these complicated and difficult to administer schemes like CDC vouchers and USAVE rebates, and the administrative cost would be very simple because it just gets paid automatically into the bank accounts or in the form of cash that these people can collect. It's a lot simpler with less red tape and obstacles. It would also make the seniors less dependent on their children, and that's a huge issue. You've got people who are looking after aging parents, as well as young children in one of the world's most expensive cities. So I think we really need to do something to deal with this.
Absolutely agree here. So for the next question, by the same person, what do you envision for Singapore to be in the next 10 years?
Well, I believe that Singapore has a huge amount of potential. We have a lot of bright young people with virtually limitless creativity and energy. We have older people with a wealth of experience and a wide range of skills. The problem is we have a stifling political system that tries to micromanage every aspect of our lives, putting a dollar value on each individual or each activity, where we should simply be doing things that make life better for our neighbors, for our friends, and our families. I have no doubt that we will face challenges in the next 10 years, but if we do away with many of the constraints that people have to face in terms of limiting our freedom of expression, freedom to get together, to speak up about the kind of society we want, if we do away with all that, we can work together to build a better society. There are many things that I personally feel are really important, universal healthcare, for example, and more equal educational opportunities. And I'm sure that many of you in the audience have other things you want to add to our wish list. Very few of these are actually out of reach of Singaporeans if we are free to work hard and live out our dreams, instead of conforming to some kind of rigid idea of what we have to do to satisfy some official KPI or other.
Thank you. So you mentioned that you have some top priorities. So what are amongst your top priorities?
Well, obviously my top priority of all is healthcare. And that's the reason why I got into politics, to try and argue for universal healthcare. As I said, Singapore has some of the best doctors, nurses, allied health professionals, infrastructure, but yet there are people who don't get the care that they need. A large part of the problem is that the perception of many of those in authority that healthcare is just an industry, that you have to make sure that it's profitable or that above all else the economics come first. But that I would disagree with, and in fact just throwing money after the problem is not going to solve the problem. In fact, this year Singapore's healthcare spending as part of government expenditure actually exceeded the defense budget. When I tell my patients that, they can't believe it. They say, how come if the government is spending so much money on healthcare, I still have to pay so much for scans or for non-standard drugs which are being prescribed by their doctors? So there's lots of questions about that. And in fact, as you know, during the pandemic, there are certain healthcare providers that have become billionaires. So if the media reports are to be believed. So what we need is like a comprehensive approach. And this is what the SDP has argued for many years. In our original healthcare plan, when we drew it up in 2012, and then when we revised it in 2019. Basically, we make it simple. We do away with the complicated, MediSave, MediShield, MediFund, MediShield Life, CareShield, ElderShield, Pioneer Generation, Merdeka Generation, etc., and have a simple universal health insurance, which everybody pays into except those who cannot afford it, and it can be used at your GP, it can be used at your public hospital, it can be also used at the private hospital. It covers the evidence-based inpatient and outpatient care, and there would be a cap on co-payments rather than a cap on benefits. How do we afford that? Basically through reinsurance, so that the very high bills are sort of taken care of. The bottom line is that no one should have to think twice about a life-saving or life-enhancing procedure just because they worry about the cost. My second priority would be education. Again, Singapore has great teachers, great schools, lots of resources, but we have a school system which fosters inequality. As Singaporean parents know, the PSLE is like a do or die exam. When you're 12 years old, so many of my friends have had to try and, I know of some of them who take a whole year off to coach their kids for the PSLE because it's a huge sorting exam which determines the future of their children. They know if the kids do well in the PSLE, get into an IP or SAP school, then they're set for life. They have a good chance of a place in one of the good local universities or in the course of their choice. If they don't, their choices are considerably limited. And in fact, 4 years later, they have to go through another big exam, the O-levels, so which those who did well at the age of 12 in the PSLE are exempted from. So this has led to huge differences between children in the different schools in Singapore, which I don't think is good for our country as a whole. The SDP has an education plan that does away with the PSLE, focuses on giving children a chance to learn and grow rather than memorize answers to questions on standardized tests. So those are my two big ones, healthcare, education.
Thank you. Those are indeed very important priorities for Singapore, for our elderly and also for the next generation of Singaporeans who will become, our leaders and the pillars of the future. Now, for the next question by Stanley, it's not me. Stanley asked, what would you do to combat the rising inflation rates and increases in factor inputs?
Yeah. Well, there's several low-hanging fruit, I think, which can be addressed. First of all, the planned GST hike. I mean, it does not make sense at all that at a time when, people are suffering, they're paying more for their daily essentials, even medical supplies are getting more and more expensive. To try and raise the cost of all of this seems to me somewhat illogical. What's worse is there's a planned staged increase. It's going to go from 7% to 8% in 2023 and then 9% in 2024. And basically what that does is it gives someone who's profiteering two opportunities to raise prices and blame it on the GST. So, right from GE 2011, we argued against the GST, which is actually a very regressive tax, because poor people spend a much higher proportion of their income on daily essentials, on consumer goods for which they're paying GST, compared to rich people who go on skiing holidays, for example, or buy luxury goods from overseas. So we need to combat profiteering, and I think we need to do that not just with local retailers, but also from international distributors like oil and gas industry, for example. I'm sure you've heard about this. In Spain, they introduced a windfall tax on the oil companies because they realized that, sure, there's a war going on between Russia and Ukraine, but the degree to which the oil prices had gone up in Spain was way out of proportion, and the companies were making record profits. So the Spanish government said, look, it's high time you paid your fair share of the taxes. So I think at both levels, at the grassroots level to make sure there's no profiteering, and I know there are some initiatives. CASE has this price kaki thing, but maybe it could be even more finely granular in that it could go down to certain essentials in certain locations, and on the macro level, making sure that multinationals pay their due and their fair share of the taxes.
Okay, now we move on to the next question. It's by Sam Tan. Sam asks, when can you be the MP for Bukit Panjang?
That's a great question. Hopefully in the next general election. Although, I really enjoyed visiting homes in Bukit Panjang, getting involved in some of the activities there. It wasn't really that far away from Holland Bukit Timah, which is where I'd been walking the ground from way back in 2015. But the reality is that we can't be sure that Bukit Panjang will still exist as a SMC in the next general election. There's no transparency at all as to how the election boundaries review committee comes up with the boundaries for constituencies. So, it could disappear, it could be carved up into different pieces and distributed among the different GRCs. We have no idea. But I think, whatever it is, priority is still to serve the people.
If Bukit Panjang disappears next election, remember that Prof. Paul has predicted it right here.
Yes.
Please come back to this video.
Yeah. I really hope it doesn't, though. Yeah.
Okay, so for the next question by the same viewer, once you're elected, what can residents of Bukit Panjang look forward to?
Well, I can tell you one thing for sure is that I'm going to start making serious steps towards moving towards part-time work and moving towards retirement, which my wife has been nagging me about for a very long time. Because I don't believe that you can hold a full-time serious job, like an academic or a bank manager, and try and be an MP at the same time. So I'll be taking steps to try and ensure that I have much more time available to work with the residents of Bukit Panjang. The SDP has a very detailed town council management plan, which is available on our website. And basically, we've seen what's happened with managing agents who refuse to run town councils for opposition-held wards. So we've anticipated that. We are prepared to run the town council ourselves. And we have specifically set aside space for the residents to choose their own members of the town council who will give us feedback on the ground. You know, so we're not totally dependent on employees or people who are hired, but we really want to be sensitive to what people want and to do projects which are actually meaningful to the people. But that's on the constituency level. You know, an MP is not just a manager of a constituency. An MP is actually elected as a representative of the people to speak in Parliament. And you can be sure that if I'm elected, I'm going to ask some tough questions, especially on healthcare and education, because these are things which are dear to my heart and which I think, like I said, you know, we have so much potential in Singapore, but we're not achieving it because of the politics.
So relatedly, the next question by TR Emeritus, what do you think about the quality of the fourth generation leadership, 4G leadership?
Okay, don't get me wrong, okay. I think that many of them are nice people as individuals. I've met a number of them at various forums or at community events, such as like the IPS forum. And in fact, the last time I saw DPM Lawrence Wong was at the National Stadium at the U2 concert. The problem is all of them come from the same mold. They have a background in the civil service or the military and have very limited experience in the daily lives of average Singaporeans. So it's not really their fault if they're unable to connect or to fully understand what's going on with Singaporeans in general. And to give you an example, some of the recent statements such as the determination to press on with the GST hike, despite the problems of inflation in coffee shops and markets, makes one wonder whether they really have a feel for what matters most to Singaporeans as a whole.
Thank you. And now for the next question by Shane Su. What is your take on EV vehicles in the long run, with infrastructure growing at a slow pace and the opportunity cost of using EV?
Now, Singapore has a very complicated relationship with EVs. And I think part of the problem is that, you know, more than 90%, I think I read somewhere that about 90% of our energy comes from natural gas. So, electricity rather. So in a way, substituting, you know, an oil or petroleum-driven vehicle with a gas-driven vehicle doesn't make a huge amount of difference if you're talking about long-term sustainability for the planet. And that may be part of the reason why, you know, it hasn't really taken off, because it hasn't caught the attention of the public, because we're trying to move away from a fossil fuel-based economy. And currently, the way Singapore's electricity infrastructure is being set up, that's not happening. I know there are steps being taken to try and get import solar energy, or I think from Indonesia, and then hydro energy from Laos to try and power the grid. But those are relatively small contributions. And it's going to take a lot of creativity to think about how to generate electricity in a sustainable manner in a city like Singapore. And I know there are some people who are looking at that. In addition, there are these strange taxes, like there's the additional flat component to the road tax for EVs, which makes EVs actually rather expensive compared to petrol-driven vehicles. So I think the government isn't really very sure about how they're going to go about, you know, they're setting up these charging stations, but again, one doesn't know whether that's going to be adequate to deal with the resources. We all know what happened with the CNG taxis. You know, they're a great idea in principle, but there were too few charging stations, so eventually they got phased out.
Thank you. Now for the next question by Fenwick Melville. What do you think of Gautamrajapaksas' presence in Singapore?
Well, you know, this is unfortunate, but the reality is that sadly the current government seems to be quite open in welcoming dictators. You know, Robert Mugabe himself, after plundering the country of Zimbabwe, he died in Singapore. And there is some effort for Gotabaya to prosecute him under international law. And I read that there's a South African group which is actually trying to find a way to confront him in Singapore and to ensure that he's brought to justice. So like I said, I mean, it's unfortunate, but you know, the way some of the things are structured here makes us a little bit of a magnet for unsavory characters.
Okay, he also asked the following question. Prof. Tomiko wrote on his Facebook that he's not happy with the underrepresentation of Malays in the undergraduate internship program under MFA. Do you think there's somewhat of a racial bias or prejudice towards the Malays within public service agencies?
Now, while it's not formal, it's quite possible that there's an unconscious bias. And Dr. Janil Puducherry actually mentioned this in a Channel News Asia program, where he cited some research done by local researchers, where they showed when they sent CVs to employers, all they did was they changed the name. They put a Chinese name, a Malay name, and an Indian name. And then they let the employers decide on the starting salary. And invariably, the person with the Malay name got the lowest starting salary. And these are identical CVs. All they did was they just changed the name. So he then went on to demonstrate this in a group in his TV program, and the same results occurred. So it's a little bit troubling, but I think this issue is deeper than this. It goes beyond merely job applications, because in Singapore, we already mentioned that primary school is so important, and the PSLE is such a big sorting exam. But to get into almost half of the top 9 primary schools, you have to have a mother tongue. There has to be CL2, because these primary schools do not offer ML2. So that's already one concern. And then we have racial quotas for the elected president, but we don't have racial quotas for, say, PermSecs or for the Air Force or the Navy. So a lot needs to change quickly to make Singapore a fairer country for all. In fact, the SDP has a Malay policy, which we came up with several years ago in consultation with Malay members of the SDP, as well as members of the Malay community. And it doesn't just deal with one particular issue, like internships in one particular ministry, but it looks at the holistic issue. And I have several Malay friends have told me they don't want handouts. What they want is a fair deal. They want to be able to compete on a level playing field with other Singaporeans. You see, instead of having to be told, okay, you want to do a job in computers, you need to speak Mandarin, or something like that, which seems to be totally illogical.
Yes. Now, next question, also by the same viewer. With the increasing support to abolish the death penalty as a form of capital punishment, especially for drug-related offences, what is the SDP's current stance on the issue?
Now, the SDP has long argued the death penalty, number one, doesn't work. Number two, it's unjust and biased against the poor. Numerous studies have shown this. Recently, someone highlighted the case of a wealthy Australian who had a couple of packets of drugs planted on his luggage, and then he was held in prison for close to a year. But he was able to afford the best lawyers in town, and so he managed to be set free. But the poor don't have access to that kind of legal assistance or legal advice, and very often they are just the drug mules. To date, as far as I know, not a single drug lord or a financier of drug dealing, these are the people who make the drug trafficking happen. Not one of them has been hanged in Singapore, whereas the vast majority of the people are hanged are poor drug mules who are being taken advantage of, or those with low IQ who don't fully understand the issues, or addicts themselves who just try and support their own habit, which is really very tragic.
Now, moving on to the next question, relating to the Pangsua Woodland development plans. Do you believe that we have achieved a healthy balance between urbanization and the preservation of green spaces?
Definitely not. We were just at the Pangsua Woodland a couple of weeks ago, and it's such an amazing place. It's a relatively small area, and it's actually a rewilded place because it's a secondary forest. It's not primary forest. It's surrounded by buildings. And what happened was that that's the amazing thing about the tropics. You leave a place open for a while, and rapidly the plants and the animals start to colonize it. And if you go on our Facebook page, you can see there are just amazing pictures that Gerald has taken about. 2 weeks ago, there was this spider, I think it was. It was amazing. And then he's seen a whole bunch of birds, and you see all kinds of flora and fauna there. But it's not just because these are cute to look at, or they're pretty to look at, but these things are a vital part of the ecosystem. When we are such a crowded city, to be able to have a green lung It absorbs heat, it absorbs carbon dioxide. In general, it makes the quality of life a lot better. So to try and destroy that for what? You know, Singapore has one of the world's lowest birth rates. A lot of my friends are moving in with their parents. So, you know, why do we need to build so much in terms of new housing? Is it just to support the billionaires who want to buy 40 units of a condo so that, you know, just to spoil the market? I mean, to me, that's kind of illogical. And the fact that we keep building and building and building and building housing, you know, on top of land which is either primary forests or actually secondary forests, which as we have seen, can be rapidly revitalized with all kinds of plant and animal life, is really very sad.
Okay, thank you. So we have completed all the questions that has been collated before this session. Now, we actually have some questions from the live audience, and from Edmund Choi, this is regarding COVID. He asks, any idea how long will we be living with COVID?
Okay, the bad news is I think we'll be living with COVID forever. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. Because, you know, when you think about it, like for example, measles. Now measles is thought to have come into human populations when men and women started looking after dogs, because it's related to a dog virus. So it crossed over from dogs into humans, and then it became established. But the thing is, most people got measles when they were a kid. So by the time they're adult, they're immune to measles. And then, of course, in the last 20, 30 years, we had MMR. I'm sure you had the MMR vaccine, whereas I had measles itself, the disease itself. See, that tells you how much older I am than you. But, you know, so either natural infection or vaccination means that we can live with measles. You know, and measles is actually on its way towards eradication, but it's taken, you know, a long, long, long time. So what happened was the SARS-CoV-2 crossed over from bats into humans, and the interesting thing is we don't know how it did. You know, whether it was through an animal or whether it was through some laboratory experiment that went wrong, but it crossed over into humans, and then of course it spread all over the world. But it's a matter of time before everybody is immune to it, see, either through vaccination or through natural infection. And then what happens, who's going to get it? It's going to be the babies who were not born at the time of the last wave of the infection. And that happens with the hand, foot and mouth disease. You know, hand, foot and mouth disease, when we study adults with hand, foot and mouth disease, we find that almost everyone has had the virus, although the majority are asymptomatic. Yeah? And so we have to look for the new generation of individuals who have never been exposed to it. So I think that's what's going to happen with COVID. You know, after a while, everybody will get infected, and then it'll be the little kids who are prone to it.
The next question is by Shane Su, and I think it's a question that's on a lot of our minds. What is your take on the current situation of monkeypox? How should we take any precautions against monkeypox?
Yeah, so monkeypox right now, you know, Singapore has already seen 9 cases of monkeypox. And I think the good thing is that means that we can detect it. You know, all these cases were actually identified by either by GPs or the patients themselves. They went to the Department of STD Control in Kelantan Lane, which actually has a very good and very discreet clinic. So any of you out there who has unusual rash in a place you don't want to show anyone, you know, go and get medical attention. Because the main thing is that this depends on individuals coming forward, and then we can, if you tell the doctors who your contacts are, then they can give vaccination to their contacts. And the vaccination is pretty effective, between 85 and 90% effective at preventing monkeypox from appearing in the first place. And it's actually interesting, because this vaccination is the vaccination that we are using is the same as the smallpox vaccination. And so again, this is where I prove that I'm older than you, because I have a smallpox vaccine scar here. And anyone in Singapore born before 1981 actually had the smallpox vaccination. And in fact, the study that I talked about, where they, you know, in the medical journal, where they had 5,000 people infected with monkeypox, you know, only 9% of them were over the age of 50. And because this was in Europe, and everyone over the age of 50 had smallpox vaccination, like me. See, so in a way they were kind of protected. So I think on an individual level, what people need to do is they need to come forward, see their doctor. If they have an unusual rash, or if a couple of them and their partner have a rash or something like that. And this is challenging because there is a lot of stigma associated with sexual health and stuff like that. But like I said, it's good that these 9 cases have been identified, and so far confidentiality has been maintained, and at least they're getting treated appropriately.
Okay, now we'll move on to the next question by Vignesh. How can we integrate GPs into the wider public health systems better?
That's a great question, and in fact, a lot of people don't realize this, but actually 80% of the primary healthcare in Singapore is provided by GPs. The polyclinics only provide 20% of the primary healthcare. The tertiary healthcare is the other way around, in that the public hospitals provide about 80% of the tertiary healthcare, and private hospitals provide only 20%. And there have been many attempts to get the GPs to be integrated, but a lot of them have been top down. What it needs to be is there needs to be mutual respect, and there needs to be mutual understanding, and there needs to be mutual trust. And I'll give you an example of this to show that it's not impossible, even in Singapore. And the example is actually in the dental system. Sometime last year, I took my mom to see the dentist. And this was a friend of mine, and she needed a filling done. And then he asked me, he said, when was the last time she had a scaling and polishing? He said, was it more than a year ago? I said, yeah, it was probably more than a year ago. Then he said, she's 85 years old. At that time, she was 84. She automatically qualifies for the pioneer generation. You don't have to fill in any forms. He just did the scaling and polishing. He did the filling. We paid like $28, and he was able to bill $130. So it's a win-win, see, because people get access to not only curative healthcare, the filling which she needed, but also preventative healthcare, which is the scaling and polishing. The private dentist, or the equivalent would be the private GP, gets reimbursed appropriately for his time, so he can keep his clinic running, he can pay his nurses, he can maintain his equipment. And essentially, the queues at the government dental clinics go down because, why would you want to go and wait 2 hours when you could go walk into this, we call that made an appointment, but we waited like 5-10 minutes, for a GP, a general practice dentist to look at us. So I think there are certain things which do work. And in fact, this is what the SDP's Universal Health Card would do. It would be like a PG card for everybody. And Singapore, we all use an IC number, right? And in fact, when he told me about this, I said, look, she didn't even bring her PG card with her. He says, all right, as long as she used the IC to register, it's in the system. And they're able to automatically recognize her as someone who is in the pioneer generation, and so eligible to a certain amount of subsidies. So I think that's what needs to be done. See, they have taken baby steps towards this. There's this CHAS yellow, CHAS orange, CHAS blue, and then there's the pioneer generation and the Merdeka generation. But it's really complicated, and many GPs have issues with that. Many GPs have worked this well, but again, it's not universally done, and there is a significant amount of paperwork and administrative costs that go into it. The other part of it is, of course, the chronic disease management, but there's a cap that goes with that. So I think the system is unnecessarily complicated. And that has actually limited the ability of GPs to integrate into the system.
Thank you. For the next question, I think you have answered it.
Well, maybe we can go ahead.
Yeah. The question is, how can we have a single payer healthcare system in Singapore, and how will it work?
Yeah. So to build on the earlier suggestion, so again, the GP level is one thing. But the private hospital level is currently another huge issue because I'm sure you've heard there's been stories of people who go for cancer treatment in private hospitals, and the doctors want to try them on a drug, which they actually do a genetic test which shows that this drug may work. This is what we call precision medicine, but the insurance company refuses to pay because it's not on the HSA label, because the company which makes the drug has not applied for an HSA label, because they have to pay $50,000 for a label change or whatever the current rate is. So again, if we had a universal healthcare system which had certain provisions for orphan drugs, which are rare drugs with rare indications, which need to be justified by the physician who's prescribing them, but had a baseline level of covering essential drugs, then I think it would be simpler because it would apply across the board. It would apply to public hospitals, it would apply to private hospitals, it would apply to GPs. And I think it would take a lot of the strain off the public hospitals. Because right now, a lot of the reason why people go to public hospitals is because they perceive, and probably rightly so, that the private hospitals are super expensive. But if the private hospitals could be reimbursed at a certain level, and then they charge extra if they want for the so-called hotel services, but the medical services, and there has to be transparency. So if everybody could buy the drugs at the government purchasing office tender rate, and if this rate was publicized so that okay, you go to a fancy room, you pay the tender price, plus you pay 50%. You go to a less fancy room, you pay the tender price plus 10% in a private hospital. You go to a public hospital, you just pay the tender price. So I think with transparency, with more information available, there's no reason why we cannot have a universal healthcare system in Singapore.
Thank you. For the next question by Teo Kuei Liang, Prof. Paul, any comments regarding the recent AMK Ang Mo Kio SCRS woes?
Yeah, I think I think this illustrates one of the major flaws with the current public housing model in Singapore. I mean, Singapore must be the only country in the world where foreigners are allowed to buy public housing, leave the country, and continue to collect rent. This is what has happened when they allow PRs to buy public housing. So that inflates the cost of public housing. And public housing essentially is supposed to be a roof over your heads. It's supposed to be a place for young people to be able to set up a family, for older people to retire in comfort and with security. It's not meant to be a casino, where you try and flip a property when you buy it in a prime location. But somehow that hasn't come through. And the result of which is you get distortions in the market. And the thing about SIRS is that you've got elderly people who've lived there all their lives. And then you're asking them to move. And then you're asking them to top up $50,000 to $100,000. Where are they going to get that kind of money from? So it's a kind of policy that on paper, it seems to make sense. But when you get down onto the ground, it doesn't make sense at all. And I think what is the good thing about it is it has exposed the whole system of the HDB. See, I mean, who in the world heard of a resale public housing flat going for $1 million? This is totally insane. So, in fact, the SDP has addressed this. And what we've suggested is that there should be a certain portion of non-open market flats, which are for people who want to, essentially need housing. Young couples who are just getting married. I mean, you talk about a low birth rate. You've got young couples who cannot find a place to live until 5-6 years after they got married. So it's really stressful, to live in a household with your in-laws who are constantly nagging you, all kinds of things going on. So I think these are things that have to be dealt with. And a good starting point, I think, would be the SDP's housing policy. In fact, former GIC chief economist Yo Lam Keong actually looked at our policy, and he felt that it was a rational way of doing it. There will be a little bit of pain. You're not going to make a windfall as we transition to a policy like that, but ultimately, I think it meets the social good goals of public housing.
Thank you. Next question is also housing related by Sandra Ling. She says, good take on the housing issue. Is there a need to build so many flats?
Yeah, I cannot understand why there's a need to build so many flats. Again, with our birth rate dropping to below replacement level, and many people moving in with their elderly parents to help look after them, by all forms of logic, there should be no need to buy elderly flats, unless the purpose of buying your flat is that you can flip it 5 years later after the MOP to some PR who's going to make money renting it out, So for the life of me, I cannot really understand why the market has been allowed to be distorted to this extent that we have to build so many flats. And again, normally there used to be this progression, you upgrade, you go to a condo. But now if you're competing against a billionaire who's buying 40 units, you've got no chance, right? So a young person like you see, it's going to be a huge struggle. You know, when I tell my junior doctors that, what was it, 6 months after ORD, I bought a 1,600 square foot condo in District 10 for $460,000. It was freehold. And they look at me as though I come from another planet. You know, they can't imagine that because that's just totally unimaginable now. And while the salaries of the junior doctors have probably doubled compared to what my salary was 30 years ago, the price of that unit has almost gone up by like 8 times. So it just hasn't gone up in tandem. And you know, that's affected it's the most expensive thing anybody is going to purchase is your home, right? So if you're going to spend your whole life working for your bank manager, essentially, if you take a huge mortgage, you know, it just affects so many other parts of your life. So I think something really needs to be done for that.
Definitely agree. As a young person who is waiting for his PTO,
That's right.
The mortgage is
it's just incredible. It's just ridiculous.
Yes.
It's insane. I'm sure you know, so many of my friends, you know, when they bought their flats or their condos or whatever it is, you know, they took out a loan and they used their savings to pay the down payment. Now they're saying they have to pay the down payment for their kids, you know, which is unimaginable. See, none of them expected their parents to pay the down payment on their flat or their condo, but that's the reality, is that this generation is actually not going to be able to live the same kind of quality of life as their parents, which is a really, really sad thing. And something needs to be done. It really needs to be addressed.
Definitely. Now we have one more question, the last question by S.K. Liang. Any comments on the Court of Appeal dismissing SDP's PROFMA appeal?
Yeah, so we're actually going to address this in a bit more detail, but let me give you a preview. What happened was we had a PROFMA issued against us. So we appealed to get the PROFMA set aside, and the judge ruled against us. So normally under PROFMA, you have the right to appeal to the Court of Appeal against this. So we applied for leave to appeal to the Court of Appeal. But unfortunately, that was denied. And we were rather surprised and very disappointed. But the reality is that, you know, that's the way the law operates. The judges could try as hard as they could, but they're constrained by the laws. And the reality is PROFMA is a really bad law. You know, the way it's written, the way its provisions, the way it's interpreted is really, really bad. And there are a number of bad laws in Singapore, and the only way to change the law actually is through Parliament. So the message to all of you out there is, if you think there's some bad laws in Singapore, you need to get more alternative voices in Parliament, people like SDP who speak up for you, and then we can get the laws changed, and then the judges can do their work. They are currently constrained by the law. So if you've got a bad law, that's it. See, right now, until the next elections.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Paul. That actually concludes this session of Ask Paul Anything. We don't have any more questions. You know, before we close off the session, is there anything you would like to add on top of today's very productive session?
Well, I think the message to young Singaporeans and older Singaporeans is that, you know, there is hope. There is a chance for a better Singapore. There are many people out there, not just in the SDP, who are working for a better Singapore, a Singapore that's based on justice and equality, and a democratic society, like we say every day in the pledge. There are many ways you can contact us, through Facebook, through Twitter, through social media, through email, but just come forward and volunteer, make a difference. Thank you.
I agree. I think that is very important. That's also how I started out as a volunteer with the SDP.